going to get started in just a minute. I just want to go over some things with you guys first. Thank you all for coming. We're really happy to have such a good turnout, especially right before a holiday weekend when traffic sucks and it's tough to get here. We appreciate you guys making the trip. Hey, my name is Megan Hunt. I'm the Vice President of Precision Athletic Training. I'm responsible for continuing education classes like this one. I've been with the company since 2012. And we've been hosting continuing education events since 2013. Precision Athletic Training is a contracting and consulting firm. We're providing athletic training services across the state of Massachusetts, continuing education nationwide. We also have CPR services for athletic trainers by athletic trainers. So if you guys ever need CPR, get it through us. It's really easy and very applicable to our profession. You know, you won't be talking about CPR in a hospital bed. Special thanks tonight to Donahue's for hosting us. Thank you to Henry Schein for sponsoring this event. Thank you so much to all of our Precision Athletic Training employees. We couldn't get events like this, Memorial Day weekend, tournament, anything that we do, we couldn't get it done without all of you guys, so thank you. If you need to use the restroom, we are taking a quick break about halfway through the lecture. Restrooms are out the door and around the corner. For those of you joining us via webinar, you should see a little handout section on your screen on your webinar panel. Please download that handout. That is your evaluation and assessment form. After the lecture, please complete the forms and email them back to me at mhunt@precisionat.com. For those of you here, your evals and assessments are in your folders along with the note page. Please return them to myself or Mara at the end of the night. We'll get you your statement of credit. You guys also have raffle tickets in your folders. Okay, we have a separate raffle for those of you who are working the event and a separate raffle for those who are not working the event. So stay tuned afterwards. We'll pull the raffle tickets. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. Glenn is a new Precision AT employee. He's been with us for the year. He's been wonderful. He's gotten rave reviews from everybody that's worked with him. He's a graduate of the Master's Athletic Training Program at Long Island University in Brooklyn. He came to athletic training from the world of exercise and personal training, where he has worked for many years with clients of many populations. Additionally, he holds multiple certifications from organizations such as FMS, the International Society of Sports Nutrition, USA Track and Field, and USA Weightlifting. Without further ado, Glenn.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out. Hopefully this will be informative for you. This is a first entry in a series addressing strength training principles for the athletic trainer. Sorry, hold on one second. We're going to examine strength and conditioning principles with hopefully some insights that are specific toward athletic trainers. In this foundations series part, we're going to lay a foundation for kind of the vocabulary for later entries in the series. Okay. Disclosures. This is sponsored by Henry Schein. I am not sponsored by anybody, but I'm open if anybody would like to. This whole series, really, I will disclose, is an homage to this book, Science, Practice, Strength Training. I am kind of using it as a template for the topics we're going to talk about, but so I'm going to be pulling a lot from this. Anytime you see quotes that aren't cited, they're from this book. I would highly recommend it. So I'm using that as a template, and if using it with some current research and anecdotes from the field. All right. First, I'm going to start off with physics because it's really the base of everything. For many years, when I was taught about exercise, people would say to me things like physics is important, levers, something about a seesaw. and I would, passively accept that message. I would memorize all the different classes of levers, and I would say to myself, whatever, I'm saying I understand you, but I don't really get it. I'm just trying to get swole, right? But one day I eventually had my matrix moment, and I could see the line of action acting in all the forces around me. And while I can't promise you're gonna have some eye-opening epiphany after this, I'm just gonna keep driving home that point that physics is important. All right, so physics has many areas. We're mostly gonna be talking about mechanics specifically. We'll talk a little Sir Isaac Newton, which I love. We're gonna talk more specifically about ground reaction force. And we're gonna talk about how we as humans use ground reaction force to do things in the world, apply force to anything at all. And we'll describe what happens when a human being is the person that's having force applied, right? Before there's movement, we have stress and deformation, and that's an instance when an athlete might come to see us. Sometimes that stress can be micro-traumatic, right? But as we know, chronic micro-trauma can lead to a true time loss injury. And then we're gonna move away from the laws of physics. We're gonna talk about the most important physiological law for strength training, the law of adaptation. It's important, that's why I say it with a dramatic voice. You're probably generally familiar with overload, accommodation, specificity. I'm gonna review these concepts and again, kind of structure how we're gonna apply them later on. For instance, does the lat get overloaded the same way that the deltoid does? What happens to the strength of our proximal stabilizers once our prime movers have become accommodated to an exercise? And how do specific exercises get us back to that confident return to play status? Or dare I say performance enhancement? And then we're gonna just touch on some basics regarding different approaches to training. Training theories are about how the body adapts to the specific demands of exercise and gives us kind of the broadest strokes of how we're gonna structure a training program. And then finally, the training effects are just an overview of the chronic and acute effects of exercise. Okay. Got to start with Newton's laws of motion. What's your favorite Newton law? Don't answer. Mine used to be 3. It's an easy one, but these days I'm all about 2. 2 is the rule if you want to hinge, push, or pull. All right, that's okay. All right, let's review Newton's laws of motion really quick, right? Inertia, body at rest stays at rest, body in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. What is force? Force equals mass times acceleration. I put the equation up there because it's my favorite law and I think it's important. What I want you to know mostly from this is that force is a vector quantity, right? That's a vaguely fancy scientific sounding term, but all it really means is that force has a magnitude and a direction. Why do I want you to know that? Because we're normally mostly concerned with how much force we can generate or how many times we can generate that submaximal force. But we spend a little less time on the direction that that force is applied and where it travels through the body, right? Whether it's in the external world or it's internal. Direction and line of action are just as important as the magnitude. 3, action reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's probably the easiest one to remember because it's almost as much of a life lesson as it is a law of motion. Okay, inertia. Some sport examples, right? Weightlifting, probably the simplest one, right? The inertia of that barbell wants it to stay, or dumbbell wants it to stay right where it is. If you want to move it, you're gonna have to apply some force to accelerate that mass, right? And then in your ball sports, right, cutting is the best example, I think. I'm hypothesizing. I feel like these guys, before this picture was taken, were running this way. The ball is moving this way, and inertia was going this one direction. They're applying force. They had to apply more force to slow down and get even more force to reaccelerate the other way. Which brings us to force. Force equals mass times acceleration, right? Wrestlers. Wrestlers are great at creating a lot of tension, a lot of force, total body tension. But where the success comes in wrestling is how that force is redirected and how it's applied. You know, whether it's to keep someone pinned or whether you're trying to escape, you're still generating tons of force, but you're trying to figure out those subtle changes of redirection. And golf, of course, we're not going to analyze the golf swing because every biomechanics thing analyzes it, but it's one of the best examples of doesn't matter how much force you're imparting onto that ball, unless it's put in a very narrow window of direction, nothing's worthwhile is going to happen. And action reaction, right? Running is probably just the simple act of running. Each time we land, our entire body weight is being stopped by the earth, and there's an equal and opposite reaction force coming up through our whole body, right? That's you know, applies to basically almost every sport out there. But also, I want to take a look at this javelin thrower because that action reaction, that ground reaction force, isn't just for lower extremity exercises. When we're doing something with the upper body, she's about to land with this right foot here and use that ground reaction force to pull her arm across her center of mass to throw it. So we need action reaction for literally basically everything we do. All right, really quickly, these are the areas of physics that are kind of relevant to our analysis, right? Kinetics is the study of how forces act on a system. In this case, it's an actual human body, but in physics speak, body can be any sort of contained thing. Mechanics is the area of physics that's dealing with motion and the effects of forces, which is obviously relevant to us. And that's your levers, your mechanical advantage, your base of support. And finally, when you look at the mechanics of biological, especially muscular activity, as in locomotion or exercise, you're looking at biomechanics. If you're interacting with the external world, you're doing one of those things. You're either moving around in it, moving something else around in it, or even choosing to do nothing at all still involves the action of force in some way. And I know that's going to sound metaphysical, but I'll give you a concrete example in a moment. Here are some examples of at a distance forces, which means they can exert that push-pull without physical contact. And while electromagnetic forces can produce movement in certain bodies, they don't affect the human body to any extent that we're going to discuss here. And gravity may not be so much a force as it is a property of space-time, but again, that's well beyond the scope of this and beyond my capacity to explain it. I'm talking about gravity in the good old Newtonian, what goes up must come down sense, right? And it's acting on everything on the planet Earth, accelerating it into the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? I underline gravity because it's the basis of ground reaction force. Ground reaction force is what allows us to do everything. I want to take a quick detour here because I was intrigued by the idea of locomotion, and I was trying to find information on how to actually perform the dance, the locomotion. There's a surprising dearth of material on this subject, even though it's apparently easier to learn than your ABCs. But if we look at the text of the song, there's a chugga-chugga motion like a railroad train, swinging your hips, jumping up, and jumping back, all of which require ground reaction force. I recommend this gets a lot more study. Okay. Everybody's okay. So this is a list of contact forces that we're probably more familiar with. I'm only going to discuss a few of these and how they relate to strength training. The most obvious way, right, is in terms of varying our resistance for exercise. And now you will hear people say, muscles don't know one type of force from another. I have issue with that statement. I'm going to explain why. I will agree that a sarcomere, the individual muscle cell, does not understand the difference between a band or a dumbbell or what kind of force. All it knows is how to contract and push. But I would argue that muscles globally do respond to different training loads and different types of resistance, or different fiber types even within the same muscle. Example, right? Standing external rotation, right? With a dumbbell, say I'm standing here with a dumbbell, I'm getting a little more exercise here at this position where it's stretched, versus if I have a band in front of me, I'm getting more exercise in this end range, right? that muscle is going to respond differently to those different loading schemes, even though your position appears to be similar. I think we can all agree that this one is useless though, yeah. Okay. Fluid force can be used for accommodating resistance, where when the more force you add, the higher resistance you get. That's pushing through water. But it's not just a factor in swimming and rowing. Air is considered a fluid, and as we all know, wind can be a significant factor in many sports. Now, normal force, I'm going to skip to normal force because this is the important one. This is the force of being at rest. This is the one I was talking about before, where even if you're choosing not to move at all, you are still being pulled upon by gravity, and it's trying to pull your body weight down into the Earth's core, but the ground stopping it, thankfully, and it's shooting an equal and opposite force back up through you. So that equilibrium between gravity and the reaction force, that's our normal force. That's the force of just standing around. All right, ground reaction force. In almost all terrestrial human movement, the individuals are acted upon by ground reaction force at some time. Even a professional skydiver, who we can assume spends a lot of time in free fall, where you would not be affected by ground reaction force, spend the most of their life walking around, looking for parachutes, picking up parachutes, putting them down, or sleeping in a bed, or perhaps a hammock made of parachutes. The point is, locomotion, exercise, or doing nothing at all still have that force. We can see these two ladies pushing sleds in the picture behind us. The only reason they can add force to move the sled this way is because they can push backward into the ground. There's a hilarious example of what can happen when we don't have that ground reaction force. I'm not going to show it here, but if you do a YouTube search for Japanese game show slippery stairs, you will see what happens when we have no ground reaction force. Unfortunately, instead of that, we're going to look at some more studies. All right, I'm going to introduce this idea here before we look at some research really quick. Base of support. This is big for me personally with a lot of exercise. This is how I vary a lot of things. Basically, we feel most comfortable when our center of gravity is balanced over our base of support. And the area, our base of support includes the area, total area between our points of contact. So if I have 2 feet, it's my feet and that whole area in between. We have a pyramid, obviously the most extreme example. The widest point of it is at the base, most stable. Whereas we have an unstable, a human being standing on one leg, like we have to do all the time, our base of support is much more narrow than our widest point. For example, an example of base of support in cueing, when I'll cue an athlete who's doing, say, a dumbbell chest press on the bench, once they get the arm motion down, I will cue them to, don't just think about your arms, think about your whole body, think about how your back, your hips, your feet are pressing down. Use all of that surface area you have contact with. Okay, so here's a couple, I'm going to briefly talk about a couple studies, not necessarily for the conclusions that they reach, but more as examples of how we can use and study ground reaction force for many, many things. All right, so this first one, study ground reaction force to measure muscle activity for mediolateral stabilization, right? That's that frontal plane stabilization while we're walking. When we're walking and running, we're constantly switching from constantly switching from a bilateral to a unilateral stance. And we're reestablishing that base of support asymmetrically, constantly under our center of gravity. A great quote from this is, infants cannot walk before they are able to maintain body weight and keep balance from one leg while switching to the other. It's like, that's the most succinct explanation I could find. One thing the study found was that at slower speeds, more mediolateral stabilization was needed. I'm not really going to talk about the clinical implications of that, but I'm just using an example of how we can get an impression of muscle activity just based on the readings from that force plate. We can see where the center of mass is. We can roughly estimate, even without EMG, what muscles are working or underworking. And this next one, this next study looked at changes in step width during acceleration in the 60-meter sprint. And the results indicate the importance of a wider step width for better sprinting performance, especially in the 9th to 12 step section. So here we have a very narrow application, right? So I picked these two because one, walking speeds, applies to basically everybody. And then we have this other one, which is applying to 60-meter sprinters in the acceleration phase of that race. So there's a ton of information that we can glean from this. A couple more. Let's move to the upper extremity. I gave that example, right? Ground reaction force doesn't just affect the lower extremity. This study examined ground reaction force in one of the most commonly biomechanically analyzed movements, the baseball pitch. Baseball pitching is a sequential movement that requires transfer of momentum from the lower extremity to the throwing arm, right? Therefore, ground reaction force during push-off is suggested to play a role in ball speed. Now, this study found that unlike for adult pitchers, ground reaction force for high school pitchers was not really correlated with ball speed. For adults, well-trained individuals, they really understand how to drive off of that leg and use that ground reaction force. The kids, they might have the strength, the skill is not necessarily there yet. I think this study also found that there was not a significant difference in the emotional maturity of high school versus adult baseball players. That's not true. Or I don't know, maybe it is true. Last one. Now for this one, unlike, this next study looked at ground reaction force passing through the upper extremity, as in a back handspring landing on a back handspring on a balance beam. So again, a very narrow application, but important. So if we keep thinking about basic support, our entire body weight is going through that relatively small surface area of our palms that are touching the beam. And then it's going up through structures that are not really designed to bear our own full body weight. So obviously would behoove us to look at ground reaction force in terms of those landings. Now this study showed that a hands turned in position apparently significantly increased the forces through the upper extremity, which is contrary to some of the literature. I have no side in this, I know nothing. I'm just saying what this study found. But I'm just illustrating as an example of how we can use ground reaction force to study all sorts of things. All right. So here are some examples of different ways we can be connected to the ground. We're revisiting that idea of basic support, which includes every point of contact. There's a whole presentation on exercise selection later, but I'll go through a couple examples looking through this lens of basic support. Right, supine exercises. Right, widest point of contact, you're lying fully on the ground. You can't get greater surface area than that. Lying down on your back of your front. Right, these would be a lot of your core exercises. Then we'll move crunches. We know how that's you get 6-packs, yes. But we also know about, as ATs, we know about diaphragmatic breathing, transverse abdominis, braced neutral spine. Then we'll move up to a quadruped position, 4 points of contact, right? This is gonna be your bird dog variations, crawling, Spider-Man, bear crawls. And you may kind of notice that this variation of basic support follow our development patterns as humans. I didn't include rolling patterns, but we start flat on the ground, we roll over, we get to a crawling position, 2 feet, 1 feet. Bilateral, right? This is 2 points of contact, standing, lots of exercises done from here. But what's the different training response if we're doing bicep curls from a standing position, assuming the posture is good? What's the different training response of doing them here versus from a low lunge? You know, what different things to think about. I would say that one's better than the other, but different situations call for different things. In addition to human development, this series might look similar to our best tests, right? Where we have our bilateral tandem, unilateral stances. And it's because it's a natural progression of stances going from bilateral to unilateral. I included unsupported as a stance here, not because I want to necessarily look at movements that are done from an unsupported position. It's more about that moment of jumping, right? Where the athlete has imparted enough force into the ground that they can actually leave it for a second. So it's more about that moment of getting up off the ground. And then just kind of as a little thought experiment, I thought I'd ask, where's the ground reaction force when someone is suspended from a bar, right? Basically, it's that little strip of the bar that is facing straight up into the air. So that all of that ground reaction force is coming through the plantar surface of those fingers, across the bar, whoa, down into the thing. Oh no, a lot of force, too much force. All right, magic. Okay. Too much force. Stress. We can play stress on the body or on our cables. How do we define stress? Stress is the measure of the internal forces of a body. This stress is either transmitted or absorbed through our bones, muscles, fascia, connective tissue. Joint reaction force is an example of one of these internal forces. This is the force generated within a joint in response to forces acting on the joint. So the force comes internally from our muscles or externally from our outside load, right? To stand up from a deep squat involves, amongst other things, right, extension at the knee. So as we're coming up, though, there's tons of specific forces, shear, compression going on specifically within the knee that are opposite of me standing myself up. Interacting with the external world subjects a person to stress. This is one of those things that's also like a life lesson, yes? Types of stresses, right? We have our external. Again, that's either moving something else, resisting the movement of something else. That's going to be your external stress. Yeah. And then your internal forces are the ones that are developed by your muscles. Eesh, oh my God. And pass through your links in the kinetic chain. I included that quote here because that, again, refers to your joint reaction forces, right? The links, we don't want them bearing undue weight. We're mostly familiar with the stress-strain curve, right? Strain is the deformation that occurs under stress. And as that force increases, the strain increases until we have some sort of tissue failure. Stress is not inherently bad, and it's necessary for us to make positive adaptations. Eustress is the term for stress which is good, as opposed to distress, which is not so good. Now, the strain caused by internal processes, this is going to be your overuse injuries, where the injury is a result of something with the internal mechanics overusing some structure. Your external loads, this would be your standard kind of overexertion strain, lifting something that's too heavy. I would also include maybe a track sprinter straining their hamstring in this category, because in that case, in my mind, the external load is the entire earth. They're pressing with maximal force and straining. And your contact forces would be your standard contusion. Baseball hits me, strain, deformation, stress, tissue damage. All right. I said at the beginning that physics is important. And I hope that you will say, yes, it is, even though whether you may get it or not. But what do I want you to remember from this section are three things, right? Ground reaction force, needed for us to do anything. Base of support, really important. Always look at your exercises through the lens of base of support. How stable things are. We can target more muscles if we have a better stable base. And the direction, that line of action. Force is always applied in a specific direction, and it's got to go somewhere. So if we're landing or doing something improperly, that force can aggravate us in not such a good way. That's it for now. Let's take a little intermission, and we'll see you in a bit. All right, looks like we're generally reconvened. Everybody's looks like on their second beer, which is good. I'm jealous. All right, leave physics behind. Moving on, the law of adaptation. 3 main principles here: overload, accommodation, specificity. 3 like biggest principles. Overload is simple. Stress on tissues must be greater than what they are accustomed to in order to elicit change, right? We need to apply a significant stress in order to adapt. There's another opportunity for that word eustress. It's a good stress that is challenging yet achievable. Accommodation, possibly otherwise known as the law of diminishing returns, or response to stimulus decreases over time. For untrained people, a 30-minute walk after dinner is a decent amount of stress, but after a few weeks, it's not going to be challenging anymore. And then after a few months, any health benefits from that are going to level off back to their baseline, right? To avoid that, untrained individuals should either start walking faster, longer, maybe start adding in some jogging breaks. Okay, wait, that's too far. But if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to become accustomed to that. We need to step it up in some way. Specificity. Now, you probably think of this in terms of thinking of exercises that are similar looking to sport movements. That's not really how I'm using it and how they use it in this book here. It has to do with the transfer of that exercise to your sport performance. So it's not necessarily how much that exercise looks like a sport movement. It's how much any exercise at all could potentially benefit sport performance. The classic question that illustrates that is, how much does an athlete's 1 rep max squat translate to their sport? It could be any sport. It's going to affect different sports at different levels. Overload principle, also known as specific adaptation to imposed demands. We can make the connection in this context that stress and demands are the same thing. Just to reiterate quickly, force is required to do anything. Stress is the physical result of that force. And stress is also the load that is placed on our bodies when we exercise. Now, as ATs, we don't want undue stress applied necessarily to the ACL, say, or the shoulder labrum, or any connective tissue structures, really. But in order for any training program to work at all, the athlete must be subjected to stress. And if that athlete is well conditioned and strong, they're going to need more and more stress in order to improve. And then they're going to need some significant stress to even maintain their fitness. So if their movement foundations are not strong, they're setting themselves and you up for some stress. If their movement foundations aren't strong, those weaknesses are going to emerge as their workload goes up. Another way of thinking of this principle is the classic axiom of no pain, no gain. Right? In the purest sense, it's true. Stress on tissues must be greater than what they are accustomed to. And I'm sorry to anyone that's purchased some exercise device through the television, promising to make you fitter, stronger, all without having to work that hard. It just does not work that way. The folks in this photo do not appear to be overloaded. But understanding this idea of stress being a good thing is not really a problem for as much of a problem for us in our athletic population. They understand that concept. Usually for us, it's us communicating to them that they need to listen to their bodies for cues to slow down, right? Oh, and not just to slow down to avoid an injury, but also to slow down so they can realize those adaptations from their training. Accommodation. Training programs need variety and stability. Now, those two things seem like opposites, and they are, right? But you need stability because the improvements from exercise build upon each other. So they need to be done in a systematic way so that we continually improve. We're going to talk more about supercompensation later, but the whole idea is based around the fact that your body, as your body adapts to stress, when you exercise again with that improved capacity, you can keep improving. And you're not constantly starting back over from ground zero like our Greek friend here. Now, when I was a chunky high schooler and decided to spend a little time in the gym, one of the few exercises I felt comfortable doing was the good old dumbbell chest press, right? I started doing 3 sets of 12, we'll say 20 pounds, I don't know. And then I kind of thought to myself, without any instructions, like, okay, I'm gonna, each set, I'll try to add on a couple reps. And once I can do 3 sets of 20, I'll move up to the next weight. And, you know, after a few years of that method, inconsistently training with that method, I was eventually pressing 45, 50-pound dumbbells. And I've continued that program to this very day, and I'm proud to say that I now dumbbell press 20-ton dumbbells in each arm. They're custom made. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, that's not true. But so that stability piece does not go on indefinitely, but we don't need constant variety. We need to have some sort of structure in order to realize those gains. Now, variety can come from exercise selection, but more commonly, it's coming from undulating those loads, playing with your rest periods, focusing on the concentric or the eccentric phase, those kinds of things. So we know we need stability, but variety is critical, but that doesn't mean it can be indiscriminate, right? No more than 2 to 3 abilities should be targeted during a mesocycle. We didn't really talk about that, but that's your 4 to 8 week training chunk. Try not to focus on more than 2 to 3 motor abilities, which is going to be really hard for us because most of those are taken up in their sports skill, and then they got their lift also. So there's not a ton of room for us to maybe work on changing motor patterns. And if you're trying to target 10 different things all at once, your gains in all of them are going to be marginal. A great example from the Science of Practice Strength Training was using the Olympic model, and they used an Olympic javelin thrower. Now, this is a highly specialized sport event, one movement, they're only practicing that one. How do you continually practice that without getting stale and adding some variety into it? They discovered for this one athlete that throwing a shot with overhand was a really good training exercise for this particular athlete. So what they did was they took it out and they only used that exercise in the year right before that competition. So through periods of trial and error, they found the things that worked best and saved them for those critical times. Another example is your West Side Barbell crew. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but these are power lifters. So they're training squat, bench, deadlift. That's it, 3 movements. You will come accommodated to those very quickly if you don't vary them. So how they get around that is they're constantly varying stance. Maybe if they're squatting, they're doing different bar positions, front squat, safety bar, low, there's lots of different ways of varying the motor pattern slightly, and it's enough to keep them from getting stale. They also have some chemical assistance, so we're not going to go into that. Specificity, the transfer of training results. This is what I was talking about, transfer of training results. I mentioned this question earlier, and we'll talk about it a little bit more now. What effect does barbell squatting have on performance? Now, if anyone can answer this question, I'm sure you are, in fact, a genius. I've listed some adaptations associated with barbell squatting. We got neural, structural, functional benefits, all good things, and all good things that we seem like we would want to improve. But when I say performance, I'm talking about the performance in running the 100 meters, or like faking out a defender and scoring a goal, or bowling a 300, or maxing out in the squat. Each of those performances are affected to some degree by an athlete's 1 rep max squat. And in powerlifting, the squat is the competition movement. And in order to bowl a 300, you don't have to squat with a barbell at all. So there's a place in everything. Although I would say that I do think everyone should squat, just for life, not for your sport. But the question then becomes, how much time do we spend improving this one skill? How much benefit are we going to see out of it? There's a very complicated formula to measure the transfer of training results from any given exercise, but it's, again, kind of beyond my comprehension, and the series is not about formulas. A classic example kind of for AT practice. All right, your athlete's been strengthening up those leg muscles with that 4-way ankle and the band. Is that strength that they've developed going to transfer to competition? Their ankle's gotten strong when they're reclined on the taping table in the AT room, jabbering away like idiots. But is that strength going to transfer when they're cutting at a high speed and a high intensity? Right? And single leg balancing on an unstable surface, that's another one. We are increasing the endurance of those fast twitch muscle fibers, which is important in stabilization, but is that ability going to translate to them balancing and cutting when they are on a stable surface? I'm not saying that the 4-way ankle or the unstable surface is bad and that we shouldn't be doing them, but think about, I'm just trying to encourage people to think about the transfer of those improvements into a sports skill. Individualization. This is the secret 4th principle that I didn't want to say because I like this reveal, right? In a way, really, behind the overload principle, this is the most important, right? Because we're all different. We all have unique needs. This quote is, again, from that same book. The general ideas underlying noteworthy training programs, not the entire training protocol, should be understood and creatively employed, right? Arnold's training program for his first Olympia was for Arnold when he was training for the first Olympia. It's not for you. You're a field athlete. I don't know why you're training like a bodybuilder anyway, but that happens. There's a certain amount of trial and error while you're figuring out what works best for each individual. So you need to be able to objectively look at the outcomes from your training and make changes if things aren't progressing, right? It sounds very similar to the way we probably approach treatments as an athletic trainer. If an injury, some condition isn't responding the way it should be, we need to take a step back and maybe look at it from a different angle. Training theories. I'm going to talk about 2 primary theories here. Basic premise of supercompensation. We're probably pretty familiar with this one. Basic idea, you have a stressful exercise, depletion of your energy substrate, most common glycogen depletion after anaerobic exercise. And then we have a restoration period where the body resupplies in excess of what it was there before because it wants to be ready for the next time. And that's how you put the super in compensation, right? Where your body's restocking above what it had before. And this is the point where you want to exercise again because your body's increased its capacity to handle that specific demand you placed on it, and your training volume will be able to increase. If you wait too long, your body will have gone back to that baseline and you're going to be starting all over again. So don't wait too long and don't go too soon. I know, right? Rest. Rest is super important. And this is something I say to my athletes all the time. You do not get stronger from your workouts. You get stronger recovering from your workouts. All right? So it's especially important in supercompensation is because your gains in this case are literally your body's extra energy storage. So if you work out again before it's resupplied, you're not going to be able to lift more than you did last time. One particular horror story I heard from a professor of mine when I was, who was a PT. He had a client who was a lifelong bodybuilder. I forget exactly what the issue was, but at some point they were looking at MRI images of his pec major, and they're noticing all these little flecks of scar tissue throughout the whole muscle. And what they kind of hypothesized was that it was probably a result of him chronically working out on a muscle that was not fully recovered and the body's going to figure out some way to get that stability. So instead of adding on lean muscle, it just threw scar tissue down and really limited the muscle's ability. So that's like one extreme example of too soon, too often too soon. Standard restoration period for most training, 24 to 72 hours. This we know, day to 3 days. Obviously, that's about 80%. You know, some training things might need more or less, but 1 to 3 days. The other training theory, fitness fatigue theory. It's a little more nuanced than supercompensation. Here, an athlete's ability to perform isn't just based on their strength potential, but on their ability to express that strength potential in the face of fatigue, illness, psychological stress, right? So the preparedness is not just their maximal capacity, it's their ability to express that capacity on the day, right? On competition day when it's important. And for example, after a single training session, right, you have some fitness gain, but you also have fatigue gain, right? They taper off, the fatigue goes away quicker, so your fatigue is recovered, but you still got some fitness gain here, so you work out again, you go up. It's very similar to the supercompensation, but it takes pays a little more attention to the recovery. So preparedness is that balance point in training between fitness and fatigue, and it's affected by slow changing factors, which are your general capacity improvement. It takes a long time to improve that. And then you have your fast changing situational factors like the weather, bad night's sleep, you know, breakfast not agreeing with you, maybe no breakfast if you are used to having it. Those are those fast changing situational things that affect your preparedness. Rest. So rest really is a critical factor for both of these approaches. And mostly they're going to look very similar, although you might see more differences in the training immediately before the competition. You can do what is called stress microcycles, where maybe instead of, you can work out those, you can include those workouts where maybe you do work out hard back to back on subsequent days. You just need to use it sparingly. Don't go to that well too often, and adjust your then rest period after that increased workload to take that into account. One final point on restoration and recovery is that this applies on the micro and the macro level too. Longer periods of lower intensity training, right, deload mesocycles, should be included in a well thought out macro cycle of your full year in order to realize those training gains. This is something I've experienced personally when I've been unable to work out for a whole week or maybe 2, God forbid, and I'm thinking, well, there goes all the all the work I put in up till now, it's all gone. I'm gonna end up on some weight loss reality show because I couldn't work out for like a week and a half. And then I come back, squat, deadlift, whatever I'm doing, and I actually feel a little bit stronger. And it's like, oh, maybe I should include more of these 2-week deload periods into my program. But obviously I never do that, and I just continue to work out really hard until I'm forced not to. Finally, we're going to summarize some of the effects of training here. We have our acute effects, right? That's during the actual activity, heart rate increase, body temperature increase, diaphoresis, one of my favorite words. Your immediate effects are going to be your effects right after your training session. So that's going to be during your restoration period where you need to back off and let your body recover. Cumulative effects, those are going to be the effects after a while. What's a while? Many years, right? Those long-term adaptations to consistent exercise. Your delayed effects, those are your gains, right? After you've recovered, your increased capacity, those are the effects after that. Partial effects are the effects of one single training means, right? So that's lower leg power from box jumps, single training means, right? Neural adaptations from heavy deadlifting, single training meet. And your residual effects, that's your time to detraining, right? How long before those training effects go away. Life hack, the longer it takes for you to build those gains, the longer it takes for them to go away. So that's a good, something I try to impart to athletes too, who are worried, like once they have an injury, I'm gonna lose everything. It's like, look, you spend a lot of time building up that stuff. It's not gonna go away as quickly as you're afraid of. And another thing, I didn't include this here, that I found personally is that it's always easier to get it back the second time than it is to get it the first time. It's not gonna be as hard as it was getting that fitness in the first place. All right, that's basically it. A few things to remember. I think this is a great quote that sums up what I think should be the goal of all training, whether it's heavy squatting, rotator cuff work, or single leg balancing on an unstable surface. The major objective in training is to induce specific adaptations toward the improvement of athletic performance. And if you remember nothing else, physics is important, overload is essential, and training programs need variety and stability. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us. Again, your evaluations and assessments are in your folders. Please return them to us. As Glenn said a couple of times, this is not just a one-off lecture. This is the first part of a series. And we'll be doing the next part, sport, skill, and strength. Right?
Yeah.
Sport, skill, and strength. Later on this summer, we're hoping to have it at the end of July. So stay tuned for that announcement.